Your neighbor just pulled into the driveway with a truck that still has the paper plates on it. Your coworker, same retirement date as you, just gutted her kitchen down to the studs. And somewhere in the back of your head, a question you don't say out loud starts running on a loop. Am I behind? If you're in your late 40s, 50s, or early 60s, you know this feeling. It's not panic, it's quieter. A small itch every time somebody else's life looks a little shinier than yours. Here's what that itch is actually measuring. Almost none of it. A new truck is usually a 72-month loan. A gutted kitchen is often a home equity line with a floating rate. Most of the time, you're comparing yourself to somebody else's debt wearing a nice outfit. The people actually winning the retirement game right now don't look like anything. Their wealth is invisible, sitting in account balances, in the absence of a car payment, in the fact that a surprise $4,000 bill wouldn't touch their sleep. The ones doing it right are the ones you'd never guess. So today, we're running your finances against real numbers: Federal Reserve survey data, Fidelity's retirement research, Vanguard's savings data. And by the end, you'll know exactly where you stand. Not where the guy with the new truck stands, where you stand. For most of you, that answer is going to surprise you, in the good direction. Quick note before we get into it. I'm not a licensed financial advisor, and nothing here is personalized advice for your situation. It's a framework built on published data that you can hold up against your own numbers. Talk to a fee-only fiduciary before making any big moves. And if this kind of breakdown is useful to you, hit subscribe. We build every video around public data, not guesswork. All right, let's start with the one thing almost nobody in their 50s has enough of, and it's not what you think.
Sign number 1, a real emergency fund. Here's a scenario. You're 56. The water heater dies on a Tuesday, and 2 weeks later, your knee needs an MRI your insurance only partly covers. 20 years ago, that combination was an inconvenience. At this stage of life, it can knock an entire retirement plan sideways because you don't have 20 more years of paychecks to rebuild what you just spent. And this is where the data gets uncomfortable. According to Bankrate's most recent emergency savings report, well under half of Americans say they have enough liquid savings to cover a $1,000 emergency without borrowing. A separate U.S. News survey found roughly 1 in 3 adults couldn't cover even a single month of expenses if their income stopped tomorrow. Most people are one bad month away from a credit card balance they didn't plan for. For someone approaching retirement, that's not just inconvenient, it's dangerous in a very specific way. If you don't have cash sitting on the sidelines, a bad month forces you into one of 2 bad choices: high-interest debt or selling investments at the exact wrong time. Think about 2022, when the market dropped hard. Anyone forced to sell shares that year to cover an emergency locked in a loss they've never had to take. An emergency fund isn't just a savings habit. It's what keeps you from being forced to sell low. Think of it like the airbag system in their car. You don't notice it exists for years. It only matters in the one moment you didn't see coming. And in that moment, it's the only thing standing between a fender bender and a disaster. So here's how to actually measure this, in 3 tiers. Tier 1 is survival, less than a month of expenses. That's where a large share of the country currently sits, and it's genuinely risky at this age. Tier 2 is stability, 1 to 3 months. You're better off than most, but a serious health event or job loss could still eat into savings you were counting on for retirement. Tier 3 is what we're aiming for, 3 to 6 months of expenses sitting in a high-yield savings account paying somewhere north of 4%, completely separate from your investment accounts. That money is not there to grow. It's there to absorb a hit so nothing else has to. If you've got 3 to 6 months sitting there right now, doing basically nothing exciting, you are, quietly, ahead of a majority of American households. That's sign number 1. But an emergency fund only protects you from short-term shocks. The bigger question, the one that actually determines whether your retirement holds up for 20 or 30 years, is the number we're about to look at next. And it's a number most people are calculating completely wrong.
Sign number 2, your liquid net worth. Here's a trap a lot of people fall into around age 55. They feel rich because their house is worth twice what they paid for it. Meanwhile, their actual liquid, spendable savings, the money that pays the electric bill in retirement, is thin. A house is not a paycheck. You can't spend the equity without selling it or borrowing against it, and either move comes with real costs and real risk. Then there's the other trap, the scary headline. You've probably seen the articles claiming you need $2 million to retire comfortably. For most households, that number is disconnected from reality, and it does real damage. It convinces people who are actually doing fine that they're failing. So let's use the actual data instead of the headlines. According to the Federal Reserve's most recent survey of consumer finances, the median net worth for American households aged 55 to 64 sits at roughly $365,000. That figure includes home equity, retirement accounts, and other assets, minus debt. Separately, Fidelity and Vanguard's retirement account research shows that the typical American's 401k or IRA balance, the median, not the flattering average, is a fraction of that headline average number you see in the news, because a relatively small number of very high earners pull the average way up. Here's the math that actually matters. The 4% rule is the general guideline retirement planners use to estimate how much you can safely pull from a portfolio each year without running out of money. Think of it like drawing from a well that needs to keep refilling itself. Pull too fast, and eventually it runs dry. Pull at a sustainable rate, and it has a much better chance of lasting through a long retirement. For a lot of households sitting near that median, a modest retirement account combined with Social Security lands them close to the edge, enough to get by, but with very little cushion for a bad year, an unexpected repair, or a health scare. Now here's the actual good news, and it's the whole point of this video. If you're 50 or older and you've got somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000 to $300,000 in liquid retirement savings, not counting your house, you are sitting well ahead of a large share of American households your age. That's not a guess. That's what the Fed and Fidelity's own data show. You don't need to be a millionaire to be winning this game. You need to be ahead of the median. That's sign number 2. But you also need a plan that accounts for the one expense almost every retirement calculator quietly ignores. And that expense is coming up next because it's the one that blindsides people who did everything else right. Sign number 3, the pre-Medicare healthcare gap. Here's a number that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Medicare doesn't start until 65. If you retire or get pushed out of a job at 58, 60, or 62, you have a gap of several years where you need to buy your own health insurance at full price with none of the group rate protection an employer plan gave you. And that gap is expensive. Multiple 2025 and 2026 marketplace estimates put the unsubsidized cost of ACA coverage for a couple in their early 60s somewhere between roughly $26,000 and $34,000 a year, depending on your state and plan, although the actual cost can be much lower if you qualify for subsidies. And that's before deductibles, copays, or anything unexpected. For context, that's often more than a lot of households' mortgage payments. Here's the part that should genuinely bother you. Almost every free retirement calculator you'll find online completely ignores this. They assume Medicare covers you the day you retire. They don't. If you're planning to retire at 60 and you haven't budgeted a separate bucket for 5 years of private health coverage, you're not looking at an incomplete plan. You're looking at a plan with a hole in the bottom of it. So sign number 3 isn't about how much money you have. It's about whether you've actually priced out this gap, checked marketplace rates for your state, run the numbers on Cobra if that applies to you, or set aside a specific fund earmarked only for pre-Medicare healthcare. That single step, separating healthcare bridge money from your general retirement number, is one of the quietest, least glamorous things a person can do. And it's also one of the things that most reliably separates a retirement that survives a health scare from one that doesn't. If you've done that math already, even roughly, you are ahead of most people your age, full stop. But there's a fourth thing that separates the people who quietly win this game from the people who quietly don't, and it has almost nothing to do with how much they earn. Sign number 4, you stay invested.
There are two ways people sabotage a good retirement plan at this age, and they sit at opposite ends of the spectrum. The first is playing it too safe, keeping everything in a checking account or a low-interest savings account because the stock market feels too risky at your age. It feels responsible. It isn't. Inflation quietly eats that cash every single year. Even a moderate inflation rate erodes real purchasing power on tens of thousands of dollars sitting idle, year after year, invisibly. The second is the opposite mistake: panic. This is where Dalbar's long-running investor behavior research becomes genuinely useful. Their annual study tracks what the average equity investor actually earns compared to the S&P 500 itself, and the gap is consistent year after year, sometimes by a couple of percentage points annually and dramatically more in volatile years, because investors tend to sell after a drop and buy back in after the recovery has already happened. Over decades, that gap compounds into a difference of hundreds of thousands of dollars on an otherwise identical starting balance. Here's why this hits differently at 50 plus. Behavioral researchers call it loss aversion, the psychological reality that losing money hurts roughly twice as much as gaining the same amount feels good. At 30, a market drop is a rounding error you have decades to recover from. At 55, that same drop feels like it's happening to your actual future, because in a real sense, it is closer to your future. That fear is exactly what pushes people to sell at the bottom. The people quietly winning this game aren't smarter than everyone else, and they're not picking better stocks. They've usually done one simple thing: automated their contributions into a low-cost, broad index fund, and made a decision in advance to stay the course when the market gets ugly. No panic selling, no chasing whatever's hot, just consistency, repeated for years while everyone else reacts to the news cycle. That's sign number 4, not a dollar amount, but a behavior, the discipline to leave the plan alone. And to make this real, let's look at two people who earned almost the same income over their careers and ended up in completely different places.
Dave and Kevin, income versus discipline. Dave, from Ohio, brings home $130,000 a year. On paper, he's doing well. He's got a truck on a 72-month loan, a kitchen renovation financed through a HELOC, $22,000 sitting on credit cards, and he contributes 5% to his 401k, just enough to get the company match, nothing more. At 55, Dave's net worth sits around $90,000. He's planning to work past 67 because he has to, not because he wants to, and retirement feels less like a plan and more like a hope with a lot of debt attached to it. Kevin, from North Carolina, brings home $85,000. Noticeably less than Dave. He drives a 6-year-old sedan that's fully paid off. He rents instead of owning, deliberately, because it keeps his monthly costs predictable. And he automates 15% of every paycheck straight into a low-cost S&P 500 index fund without exception, market up or down. At 55, Kevin's net worth sits around $510,000. He's on track to approach $800,000 by age 60 and potentially cross $1.2 million later in his 60s if he stays consistent. Dave and Kevin are hypothetical examples, but the math behind their choices is very real. Same decade of life, lower income, more than 5 times the net worth. The difference wasn't luck, and it wasn't some secret investment Kevin found. It was that every dollar Dave spent trying to look successful was a dollar that stopped compounding the moment he spent it, and every dollar Kevin didn't spend kept working for him quietly for years while nobody was watching. That's the entire lesson of this video in one comparison. Nobody was clapping for Kevin at the barbecue. He's the one quietly winning.
Your 3-step retirement checkup. So let's bring this back to you. Stop measuring your retirement against your neighbor's driveway. You're not playing his game. You're playing a longer one, and the scoreboard for it is invisible to everyone except you. Here's what to actually do with everything we just covered in 3 steps. 1. Calculate your real liquid net worth, separate from your home, and compare it honestly against the Federal Reserve's numbers for your age group. Not the scary headline number, the real one. 2.
Build your emergency fund up to 3 to 6 months of expenses and separately price out what health coverage will actually cost you if you retire before 65. 2 different funds, 2 different jobs. 3. Automate your investing. Pick a low-cost, broad-based approach and commit, in writing if it helps, to leaving it alone when the market gets scary. Drop the expensive advisor if all they're doing is charging you a percentage to tell you not to panic. The comfort you're looking for at this stage of life was never going to come from the car in your driveway or the kitchen you didn't renovate. It comes from the quiet stuff, the fund nobody sees, the balance you didn't touch during the crash, the gap you actually planned for. If this video helped you see your own numbers a little more clearly, hit subscribe. We break down exactly this kind of real, sourced retirement data every week. Drop a comment and tell me where you actually stand after watching this. You might be further ahead than you thought. And if you want to go deeper on the healthcare gap we talked about in Chapter 4, that's exactly what next week's video is built around. Thanks for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.